Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we talk with Professor Dan McQuillan, author of Resisting AI, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence. But first, our regular look at the latest tech news with panellists Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Burning Platforms. It's great to have our guest this week, Professor Dan McQuillan, who, given his Danness, we are going to call Professor Dan today, who's the author of Resisting AI, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence. Thanks for making the time in the different time zones for being with us, Professor Dan.
You're very welcome. It's worth it just to be called Professor Dan.
Yeah, well, you'll be sick of it by the end of the show. Plebeian Dan, welcome from Perth. How are you?
I'm good. I'll know never to answer to Professor Dan, but
I don't think
I'm used to that.
Yeah, and Lizzie O'Shea, Chair of Digital Rights Watch. Thanks for being with us from Melbourne, Lizzie.
No title needed for me.
No, but you're renewing your acquaintance with Professor Dan as well. Actually, you put me on to Dan's work a few months ago, and it's really got me thinking, and so I've been really keen. We've been trying to line this time up a little bit between time zones and school holidays and various other things. So, I'm really looking forward to this discussion, particularly in the context of the is it or isn't it AI bubble that we're in at the moment. But before we get into that, let's have a look at what's been going on around the ever increasingly fast world of tech innovation. Lizzie, Sora launched and there was much, much hype. What did you make of it all?
So this is the week that Sora launched. It's obviously a video generation platform that produces deep fakes, but what it is also by invite only. So it's essentially a synthetic social media service website. So you've got to be invited to participate and you can generate fake videos. It appears to be a much higher quality than previous versions of this, but I don't know. I just feel like there's a kind of gleeful carelessness with which they release this product. And already there's just some awful use cases that are coming to light. I mean, the potential use cases that are harmful is a very long list. But, people are talking about the capacity for it to be used to generate distrust in all other forms of video technology, which is obviously a huge problem. So it's not just that you will believe the deep fake, but that you won't believe any videos at all, and that it will be very difficult to source truth. Then, of course, there's the potential for it to be used in things like scams, in destabilizing politics, in generating really awful, violent content. There is supposedly some guardrails on this product, but they do seem to be circumventable at least. And, the video that kind of went quickly viral was one of Sam Altman shoplifting from Target. So you can put your own image into it and then create all sorts of videos. But there's been videos of kind of that look like body cam footage of potential violent situations, of bombs going off in the street and the like. So the guardrails supposedly are there but aren't working very well. Sam Altman released a blog 2 days ago now talking about how they expect to change things, because the other big issue is the use of copyrighted material in these deepfake videos, and creators and rights holders have the option to opt out. Disney, I think, has opted out, but it's there's no brand safety to the extent that that's a concept. So anyone who is in there can have their logos, their other kinds of assets for their company used in all sorts of different ways. But Sam Altman's clearly a little bit concerned about this, because he released a blog talking about ways in which he's going to try and stop that. And the last couple of sentences in that blog fill me with unease. He says that we'll make some good decisions and some missteps, but we will take feedback and try to fix the missteps very quickly. I just have so much faith. It's just excruciating.
Hey, Dan, this is obviously opening up a range of potential user cases. One which you sort of drew to our attention this week is the rise of synthetic actors and thespians, as they might be called, including Tilly Norwood. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, this is related, but perhaps slightly different. I mean, so Tilly Norwood is a fake character, effectively, that's been created by someone, or a fake actor that's been created, and she's young and beautiful and flawless and all those things, but she's also like not real. And apparently, there's a bidding war going on for people to be able to use her in movies. So it's not a deep fake per se in the way that Sora is with that Lizzie was touching on, but it's effectively using or creating a completely artificial person that effectively replaces the need for actors, right? And look, I've said this a million times before. I'm the tech bro on this podcast. I'm a believer in the technology. I'm deploying it right throughout my organization, seeing huge benefits, but I'm just allergic to this kind of use of AI in art. Effectively, it cheapens the entire thing. Lots of actors have come out and sort of opposed this and saying it's crazy, and I guess I'm with them. It just demonstrates that what I think is likely to happen in the long run from this is we're likely to see a scenario where you're going to have these big blockbuster films which are pretty formulaic, which are largely AGI or computer generated graphics now anyway. It feels like they're just going to become entirely AI driven slop effectively, and then hopefully there'll be this sort of smaller, no doubt, but nonetheless other subsection of movies and television where it's going to, they'll have to be proudly saying that there's humans, real humans were used in the making of this recording, and hopefully there'll be enough of an audience that cares about that to go for it. But I guess time will tell. The whole thing is gross. The whole thing is gross.
I reached out around the Sora to a colleague who had been testing it and is a bit of a booster of it, and kind of posed the question, what are the positive use cases here? And Professor Dan, I think it's a question that arises with a lot of these new things onto the market. It's almost like a could we or what can we do rather than a should we do. How do you look at it when you see this constant barrage of new uses to a technology that I know you're hugely skeptical of hitting the market in this way?
Yeah, well, I think it's funny that one of the popular videos was Sam Altman shoplifting, because that's essentially what the whole industry is doing in a global sense, right? There's just a massive smash and grab of all the products of human labor, really. I don't really care about Sora in a way. I mean, I'm with Bojar on this one. Disneyland is only there to make the rest of America look real, and it's the same with this stuff. What I do think is more interesting about it is, which has really come out already, is the utter degradation that this applies to society and the absolute contempt with which it's mobilized. And I don't think this is like a secret anymore to anybody. We're well down the line with this one. And I think really the interesting underlying dynamic is what I think is the inevitable latent backlash to all of this stuff, and how we, as thoughtful and reasonable, critical people, are going to deal with that backlash.
Yeah, Lizzie, just to round this off, it just seems like it's just another little piece of evidence in the growing book that it's a technology and source of a meaning at the moment. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the uses Dan has in his business probably in the second half of the show. But just in terms of the diversion economy and the attention economy, it just seems to be creating its own reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think this industry is in search of monetization, and they do mention this, like Sam Altman does talk about the need to monetize and how expensive it is to generate these and why it's not on mass release. There is this huge pressure now to monetize this industry. So that's going to be, I think, quite interesting. In what way does the advertising model creep into the enshittification process happen in a synthetic social media setting full of deep fakes? I mean, I don't think it doesn't feel like there's any real pretense anymore. Ugh. Yeah.
Speaking of enshittification, the great Cory Doctorow has coined another phrase in the past week, which is societal asbestos, which is a beautifully rich metaphor for what the uses of AI that then end up being absolute poison in the longer term. I don't know if you know much about the history of asbestos in Australia, Professor Dan, but it was the key to socialising housing. Everyone was able to build a home with fibro, which was fine until you break up the bits of the fibre and you realise it's a poison. So I
But
think
also,
it's
but
a
also
great.
the company knew that it was poisonous and tried to cover it up for decades. And then when they were successfully sued, phoenixed and tried to escape liability. So this is also a future we can expect in this in the context of AI, I think, if we're not careful.
But he's great at picking a line. Sorry, Professor.
Well, I was just going to say, that one boast about, well, the fact the only function that any of these particular technologies have is pattern recognition, but actually the pattern recognition is we need it, right? These are not new stories. The same thing was true of, petrol in the first place. It was known since the 1920s that it was toxic, and since the 1950s that it was contributing to climate change. So I think, the onus is on us to recognize the patterns around so-called technological innovation and who's interested in serving and who's likely to pay the price.
Just on that theme, and probably leaning into my little curio I want to bring to the table this week. So, in terms of seeking a business model, it seems the next door is being opened. We had this week Meta integrating AI chatbots into targeted advertising. So Meta released that it would start personalizing content and ad recommendations based on people's interaction with their generative AI. At the same time, and Dan drew this one to my attention, OpenAI is hiring for a growth paid marketing platform engineer whose job will be to develop tools for the platform to, monetize eyeballs within the GPT. And then, of course, some of us would have seen that LinkedIn is also having a crack at ensuring that if we're using that we're aware that it is scraping all our interactions as, again, to train their models. So a few things going on there, but I think the one that interests me, Dan, is this idea of advertising going, well, in a way, the large language models that people are subscribing to going from being a fee-for-service product to a service that's got an advertising model embedded in there. We've seen what happened with social media. Is there any reason to think that the move is going to end differently when you start embedding effectively an extractive model of surveillance capitalism inside the GPTs, or is it just going to send it off in a whole different direction?
I mean, I think it's going to be worse, but which probably isn't very encouraging, but it's on brand for us. Look, I think I'll talk about Facebook first, and then we'll talk about Meta. So sorry, about Meta first, and I'll talk about OpenAI. So it's hard to keep up. This is not surprising that Meta or Facebook are doing this, right? I mean, one of the core changes of AI and this new computing paradigm is that it enables you to interact with computing using chat and voice. And so, of course, Facebook, as I think the second largest advertising company in the world, is going to figure out a way to monetize that with advertising. I mean, that was inevitable. I know you hate that term, Lizzie, but it was inevitable, at least, that they were going to be doing that, right? Like that's not a surprise to me at all. It was there was a little bit of hope, though, that OpenAI wasn't going to go in this direction. But clearly the economics of this, and this is not surprising to me at all, but clearly the economics of this have just forced them to go this way. So it's pretty clear that OpenAI are going to be introducing a business model, or at least most likely going to be introducing a business model whereby the vast majority of their users are monetized with advertising, and then there's a proportion of them that are monetized with subscriptions. But that's a very small proportion. I mean, I know this from my days in media. You know, the percentage of your actual readers that are prepared to pay to support a publication are tiny, and you monetize the rest with advertising. What worries me is how the targeting capabilities and data extraction capabilities of ChatGPT and chat can be exploited in this new environment. It seems like it's a whole new problem that we're going to have to come to deal with.
And you're going to have the targeting, but then you're also, if you carry on the behavior modification to lead to the increased extraction of data, then that almost poisons the models anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you can see the advertising being more effective than it has ever been before because of the intimate nature of the interaction with the end user, right? So you can imagine you're having a conversation with ChatGPT, and some of those interactions then end up becoming sponsored, but it's done in a way where there's this very human voice talking to you that sounds like your friend that you speak to all the time. I mean, it feels like it's a level of manipulation which is, one, personalized, again, opaque, and is likely to be hugely effective as an advertising vehicle. And that will cause, that's fine when you're selling I don't know, a paperclip, but it's not so fine when you're selling political advertising, for example. So we see how they manage that.
Or gambling.
Yeah, Lizzie, we were. Yeah, you go.
Well, gambling. Professor Dan may not know this, but Australians lose more per capita to gambling than any other country in the world. And gambling customers are some of the most surveilled people, because gambling companies boast that they know what someone's going to spend the next day based on what they spent the day before. And they do deploy these tools, right? They have people call up, pretend to be the gambler's friend, and offer them bonus bets, or say, we're going to, like, they actually deploy staffers to do this, right? It's well documented. It's very manipulative. And now there's this even greater capability to insert yourself in all sorts of settings. So the regular kind of chatbot scenario that you might encounter on social media, but also say, like, friend this, horrible product, whatever, this horrible product that's causing ripples in New York through the advertising, because it's an AI companion. And you think that's a very vulnerable position you're being in. You're encouraged to make friends with this, and then to monetize that you might be able to use placed advertising without requirements for disclosure, say. It's got the real potential for exploiting vulnerability for predatory industries in particular, I think.
Oh yeah, and if you draw the line, you've got the capacity for deep fakes in politics, plus AI companions, plus a business model of advertising, and then wrap that up into a product where political movements can buy engagement. Like, forget about as Dan says, if you're selling a Subaru, like, that's one thing. If you're selling an ideology, that's a pretty potent mix, isn't it? And I don't know, like, I suspect I know what the professor is going to say, that is, why are we even talking about how messed up this stuff is? But over to you, Professor.
Okay, so my pattern is obviously clearly predictable. The gambling link is really interesting, I think, because that's how I see the whole of what's going on with the AI industry. And it's really interesting to reflect back on the fact that one of the reasons why this stuff is so toxic and escapes any of these so-called guardrails, which are a complete joke, is because none of the people actually making it, the actual engineers themselves, have any idea what's actually going on inside. These are fundamentally opaque technologies, so there's no real way to constrain any of this tsunami of harms that we're talking about. And yet, this is the technology that's being promoted as the future of economic growth. In my context, the future of higher education, or any education altogether, or healthcare, or whatever. This, to me, strikes me as like a fairly sort of planetary scale gamble.
How are you finding because I've got a number of friends in academia that are just feeling like giving the whole game away, that there is now almost an arms race between not just the plagiarism that's become sort of baked in, but now the loading up of references that no mere mortal would put into a paper, and the real killing of original thought, and then the whole job of the teachers and the lecturers and the academics being to police that rather than to bring out the best in the students. Is that your experience?
Well, yeah, that's the immediate experience, and lots of good people have left already, and quite understandably. I think the problem is a lot of the narratives around it of the kind that are being mobilized. It's like industrial scale cheating, or how dare my professor use generative AI to mark my coursework. These are actually distractions from what's happening with all this stuff, really, which is that there's a lot of underlying dynamics that are already there, and along comes AI and just sort of caps it off, like just intensifies it completely. So, students are already in a higher education system that isn't really about education before AI came. It's about metricization. It's about counting heads, counting numbers. It's a factory system. We as higher education workers are already in a precaritized system. We've got more and more students, less and less autonomy, less and less capacity to do real teaching, whatever it is. These things are already true. This is a product of neoliberalism. And then along comes AI, and it's the straw that breaks the camel's back.
In more good news, Dan, let's talk about a straw that might be breaking the camel's back when it comes to the work of one of our major consulting firms, who have, of all things, given the government a report into the way that welfare payments should be managed in the wake of the robo-debt outrage and debacle, but they dialed in a bit of the work.
Yeah, this feels like a modern day Monty Python sketch in some ways. It's kind of it's almost comical, except it's not. So, and it's by the way, it's a useful follow up perhaps to what we were talking about on our last show, where we talked about AI slop being served up, not just on social media, but in the workplace, and the fact that people are using AI to generate reports and slide decks and those sort of things, and how a lot of that, the information that was going into those was being made up, or hallucinations from the models that were being used. And now we have a real world example of this, right? And with pretty significant consequences, I think, or at least it potentially had significant consequences until it was picked up. So Deloitte Australia have agreed apparently to issue a partial refund to the federal government after admitting that artificial intelligence was used for the creation of a report which cost, get it, $440,000, and it was littered with errors, including 3 non-existent academic references and a made-up quote from a federal court judge. So the report itself was commissioned by the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, and as you've touched on, Peter, it was basically on the IT systems used to automate penalties in the welfare system. Think robo-debt. So obviously that's pretty ironic, given that this report itself seems to have been automated, or at least significant parts of it were. So look, not only is this unfair, obviously, on the government department itself that commissioned the report, but it's obviously also unfair on the academics that were mentioned in the report. So Lisa Burton Crawford, I think, from UNSW, and Carolyn Adams from Macquarie, as well as the Justice Davies, who was misspelled in this report as Justice Davis. And, obviously what it does is, this was picked up in this circumstance, but if it wasn't picked up, people would have been making decisions that impacted on everyday Australians based on references that did not exist and were not real. Now, what's interesting about this is that the academics that were referenced in the report have come out publicly and said, well, I mean, they're not happy, clearly, but they've also said that, look, the vibe of the quotes were plausible and pretty similar to what their findings were in some of those academic reports that actually did publish. But it just goes to show that it's sort of, these things are all deterministic, and it feels like we're now going to be making government policy decisions based on the vibe. I mean, based on the castle. It's a really disturbing phenomenon. And I'll finish with this, right? Because the report also included a reference, as I've mentioned, from a Justice Davis, which we think is a misspelling of Justice Jennifer Davies. And the made-up quote from the which was non-existent, was, "The burden rests on the decision maker to be satisfied on the evidence that the debt is owed," which again seems pretty ironic because the evidence seems to have been made up in this circumstance.
And, this would be one of the most scrutinised reports that government is doing, given that we've just it's like our version of the post office outrage, Professor, but likewise, there's been a whole dramatisation of it on television at the moment, the People versus Robodebt. And so what other reports are being dialed in a similar way, Lizzie, being someone that works in the legal profession as well, I'm sure that there's examples going on in cases at the moment as well. So
totally. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind is that I know, I think it was Cam Wilson that was doing some of this reporting, who was on the pod last week, about procurement of submission review systems within government, so they could automate the process of reviewing policy submissions, which, as somebody who makes a lot of policy submissions, feels particularly disheartening. And there was actually, when I was looking for Cam's reporting on this, because I think he found out through an FOI that there was a procurement process underway for that, but that there was actually an experiment that Amazon did for, I think it was the ACCC, which came out in a Senate inquiry, a question on notice for a Senate inquiry, where they experimented with using AI's review of submissions, and they compared it with a human review, and basically on every rubric the human scored much higher than the AI review system. But you can imagine a system where it's not just generation of reports for government, but then government starts automating the process of public consultation. I mean, I know a lot of public servants there in my life, and I'm always a bit frustrated when I realize that a lot of times you're being consulted, it's when the public servants already know what outcome they're looking for. And like this automation of policy submissions is just like kind of another step further down the path. And I do think there's a bit of there's a lot of talk in AI policy in Australia about government as exemplar, and this kind of stuff is just really starting to give me the irrits. So they shouldn't tolerate it in reports that they pay a high penny for, but they also shouldn't be doing it themselves, I think, if they're actually trying to govern,
which doesn't even start with the actual cost of the work involved as well, which we're all obviously in the wrong business. You know, in the UK, government has embraced AI as a solution to all sorts of problems, Professor. How are you watching that play out over there?
Well, I could give you the soundtrack of my head smashing against the desk, I suppose, because that's pretty much what it's into. I mean, I'm tempted to do it right now, really, listening to this. I mean, I followed the Robodebt scandal very closely, actually, because I thought it was hugely illustrative of what was to come. And I think that's kind of unfolding now. Also in the UK, because, I mean, there's very specifically I've lost track slightly, there's still two bills going through Parliament, but there'll soon be acts. One is the Data Use and Access Bill, and one is something like the Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. And so together what they'll do is, enable unfettered information sharing, automated decision making, and the real-time scanning of welfare welfare recipients' bank accounts, and put this all through an algorithm to decide who's defrauding the government. I mean, it's when I wrote about this stuff before, I was saying that really the inevitable effect of AI will be to take something like the Robodebt scandal and scale it, because that's what AI does as well. Of course, it scales things. So what we're really seeing is the scaling of a bad effect. But I want to come back to what Lizzie was saying, really, that this isn't, again, and I'm going to try and make a positive out of this, but I'll probably fail, which is that nothing about this is new. AI itself isn't new. Nothing about this is new. The process of policy was already, we did talk about evidence-based policy. It was really policy-based evidence making a lot of the time. The cruelty behind something like Robodebt or the bills in the UK is already there. The suspicion and marginalisation of people who dare to claim benefits from the welfare state is already embedded over a decade. So these things aren't new. AI is coming along and scaling it, amplifying, intensifying it, which we should really pay attention to. But what we should also pay attention to is how we got there in the first place and what we can do about it. And I think if there is a positive, that's the positive, right? AI is forcing us to pay attention to a lot of stuff that was already there because it's become so gross and so florid. We really have to go back and say a lot of this stuff needs to be rethought and redone.
That probably segues into the discussion about your book, because I feel that we've just spent half an hour whinging about how bad the world is. And what I really loved about your book was it creates a counter narrative that it's not inevitable. I think with a lot of the things we talk about, there's two schools of thought. It's just that the AI hasn't got good enough yet, and a lot of these things are going to be bugs that can be worked out. And the other narrative, obviously, is it's happening. There's nothing you can do about it. The horse is bolted. You don't believe the horse is bolted. In fact, you're very active in the social networks I see, just challenging every day that this thing's heading for a fall, and then you've built an alternate model around it. So. Look, firstly, thank you for that work, but also maybe start off with a little bit of your analysis of where we are at the moment. Is this a bubble? Is it fragile? And then, if it is, what does that mean?
Yeah, maybe we could start from the bubble thing and work backwards.
Yeah,
but the bubble question is really interesting because we've reached a stage where the critique of AI, if you like, has become a public matter. When I wrote the book, it was partly because I could see this technology was coming. At that time, just a few years ago, it was in the background, and I felt very much that this was something that was going to affect everyone's lives, and it wasn't being really recognised or paid attention to. Now we're in the opposite situation, and so it's a matter of sort of daily discussion. My mum phones me regularly to talk about the latest things she heard on the radio about AI's energy consumption or whatever it is. So this stuff is a matter of public discourse. But I think also, there's so much myth making and diversionary, as you mentioned before, diversion and distraction around AI. We have to be really careful about it. I mean, I do think the bubble is interesting because we should ask if it is a bubble. I mean, clearly it's unsustainable. Even the toxic advertising stuff we talked about earlier has no chance of sustaining the level of spending and capital investment that's gone into AI. This is orders of magnitude higher than anything like that can possibly recover. So the question is there a bubble, or is there actually a transformation going on, a larger transformation? Is this in some way too big to fail? Is it representative of a different kind of process? And this is just another question, but it's another way of looking at the same question. And the concerns I'd have, the symptoms I'd read about that, for example, would be the concerted abandonment of climate targets over the last year or so by all of these big companies, the concerted abandonment of commitments that their technologies will never be used for warfare. What's the biggest funder in any state at any time is the military-industrial complex, and AI is definitely cozying up to that as fast as possible. could say that, in fact, one of the potential answers available to our masters for the general failure of the economic system would be a war economy. I mean, that's already happened in Russia, and I don't think that's an outlier. I think it's probably presaging what's going to happen in lots of other places. So I think that if we're thinking about AI, we're thinking about what's the role of AI in this larger set of changes. And that's what I was trying to think about before, really. What is it about this? I think it's important to pay attention to the particular technology. AI is a myth, it's a narrative of inevitability, which is the first thing we should question, because it isn't at all inevitable any more than anything else is in human and social and political affairs. But it is also a specific technology, has specific characteristics. And I think, as I was just saying about the Robodebt stuff, the useful thing about AI has a use is understanding exactly what it's amplifying and intensifying, and to my mind, trying to invert that. And that's what I was trying to do with the resisting AI.
So I'm not asking you to go all Ed Zitron on us, but do you see this moment coming to a head, or is it just business as usual as far as you're seeing it? Like it's a slow build up, or is there a bubble that's about to pop?
Yeah, well, kind of both and neither, I suppose. I mean, the whole business as usual thing is quite interesting. That is one narrative that's mobilized around AI at the moment. And you can see why it's an attempt to deal with all the hype, because the first trap with AI is that the hype around how good it is and the hype around how terrible it is in an apocalyptic sense are really just mirror images. They're just two sides of the same coin. And so people, understandably enough, want to reject that hype cycle. But at the same time, I don't think AI is technology as usual, business as usual, in the sense that I fundamentally don't believe, for example, it's a form of automation. This is where we could get into discussions about workers' control or whatever it is, productivity or whatever it is. I don't think that's what AI represents. I think what it does represent is not, we're not just talking about a crisis bubble in the AI economy. I would invert the question and say, what kind of crisis is it that AI is trying to deal with? I'd say that I'm no fan of the status quo system that we're in, but that's clearly collapsing or fragmenting or fractalizing, whatever you want to call it. There is no neoliberal system anymore. There's certainly no liberal world order, as if that was ever really a thing. But whatever it is that we were living in is not there anymore. We're in a process of transformation under what people sometimes call polycrisis, the financial crash, COVID, the climate change primarily. So there's a need for people who wish to sustain the current distribution of power to come up with ways of doing that. And I think that's really a much better way of reading AI. So it's not so much that AI itself is the crisis. It's more like, what are the crises that AI is there as a way to try to desperately deal with in a way that sustains other existing relationships. And for my mind, how could we do things differently?
So one of the things that I think is interesting about your work, Dan, is the book is called Resisting AI. It's not called There Might Be Benefits, but we have to, manage the downside, which is so often what you hear when you talk to elected representatives, when you talk to policymakers, when you talk to regulators. That is the message that I get. Oh, sure, we're interested in looking at the downsides and managing them, but we have to embrace this technology because it is the future and the benefits are immense. And, I was in a consultation the other day where the relevant minister said the biggest risk is that we miss the opportunity to embrace this technology. And I said, I don't think that is the biggest risk. But anyway, I do think you're one of the few thinkers out there on this topic. I mean, there are more of you than just you, but the point is many people talk about it in those balancing terms, but you're much more strict about it. You're much more focused on resistance rather than, say, regulating, managing, or preempting harm and trying to put that into the system of regulation of the technology. Can you talk a bit more about that position?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe it's also related to what I gather is a fairly regular and recurring sort of theme of the podcast. It's like of the sort of unfolding, as I was saying before, sort of tsunami of horrible things that comes out of AI. I'd feel a bit like saying, I don't know, how much evidence do you need? It's like, I'm just not seeing it. I never saw it. That's the thing, and it's mainly because I just made it my business for whatever reason to sort of look inside the black box and look inside the technologies at the beginning, because I wanted to say, this technology is not going to be used for good purposes if we leave it as it is, but maybe we can repurpose it and find a better use for it. And unfortunately, whatever, but my conclusion really was that that's not what this is about. It's about more the kind of thing I was talking about a minute It's not a productive technology. It's not a socially useful technology. It's made for different purposes. It has a different character. It's fundamentally anti-worker. It's fundamentally anti-social. It's fundamentally anti-climate. And we need to sort of draw a line there and start with something different. And I think that it's taken me a while to understand why, to be honest, there's such a commit. In fact, I think that's still an open question for me. Given all the evidence, let's say if you went back through your back issues, if that's the right word, of a podcast, and looked at all the awful things that are coming out of AI, how do we understand people's commitment to AI? Particularly decision makers, particularly those in power. My way at the moment, and it is very focused as well, because I'm in the UK and I see this made very explicit. I mean, that's another thing about AI, not to ramble too much, but it does make things very explicit. And the very explicit thing in the UK is that the only thing that matters is growth. Nothing else matters. The environment actually is subsidiary to that. People's social existence is subsidiary to that. The only thing that matters is growth. And I'd sort of pick that one as one of the first ones, that this is a technology that not just simulates video, it simulates growth. And since growth is the center of the capitalist economy, and that's the only thing that keeps the people who have money and power in positions of money and power, this is what they're reaching for right now, when there are actually no real forms of increased productivity in the current context that we've got. So yeah.
Professor Dan, I'm going to challenge that a little bit. So full disclosure, I think if I was going to write a book, it will probably be titled something similar to what you said earlier, Lizzie, which is we need to harness the benefits of AI and mitigate the downsides. But so I suspect that we're going to have a bit to disagree on here.
You need a better title.
Yeah, something more catchy. I'm sure you can help. Anyway,
call it On the Other Hand.
On the other hand, something like that. So look, I run a technology company, a health technology company in Australia, and we are seeing really substantial benefits from the deployment of AI. We're seeing that from a productivity standpoint internally. So in two particular areas, we have automated a really substantial part of the text-based interaction with our customers and end users. And what that's enabled me to do is free up more of my customer support team to spend more time dealing on the phone or on video with our customers and with our consumers and patients on one side of our marketplace. So that's a real benefit. The other really significant benefit we're seeing is really substantial productivity gains from our engineering team, from our coders, where we're basically getting, I mean, it's not quite this straightforward, but about 20 to 25% productivity gains with what we've done so far. And we think we can get to about 50% productivity gains by the end of this year. So that's internally. And then we've also released products, right? So we've released an AI receptionist product, which effectively, I mean, it's fairly straightforward functionality. It answers the phone of a medical practice. It makes changes or cancels a booking for a patient. That's based on our research, about 55% of incoming calls to a medical practice where the receptionist is run off their feet, and it's able to do that. And the benefit of this is also for the patient, because they're not having to wait on hold, and you can have 30 people calling at one time, and it works pretty well. And we're able to automate more processes going forward. It's not a crisis, but it is certainly a substantial improvement on some fairly mundane tasks. Why is this not worth celebrating?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of common threads in there with things that I would obviously disagree with. So that's to preface how we're going to go. I mean, obviously you're a very nice guy. So when you say you're freeing people up, you really mean it, rather than sort of intensifying their workload in other areas or whatever it is. I mean, the broader experience, I would say, I mean, firstly, to preface it, honestly say, the thing about approaching AI is really to try and understand it in a systemic sense. When I talk about, for example, around AI and disability, which is really quite a contentious area, because a lot of disabled people would view something like AI and its capacity to make transcriptions or something as a benefit. I would situate that within the larger changes that are happening. For example, in the UK, all of higher education getting rid of their sign language people because they're replacing it with AI. So the systemic effect of these things is, I think, what's really important, rather than necessarily individual case studies where some individual, and this is absolutely the case with coders. I mean, I'm in the computing department, so I'm surrounded by people who constantly on a daily basis want to show me how they saved 20 minutes this time because they didn't have to look something up on Slack Overflow or whatever it is. So I would say first off that I'm talking about systemic things rather than case studies. But even there, I think there's really an increasing, again, emerging body of evidence that this isn't really even what we think it is. It's the percentages that you mentioned are quite interesting. There's a study that came out of coders themselves who showed that they believed that they were saving 19% of time on their productivity. And by doing a sort of material analysis of the time that they then had to spend, tweaking the little things that weren't quite right about the AI code, it showed they are actually losing 21% of time over what they had over the baseline. So I'm saying that because I find it really interesting, because I am surrounded by people in the computer science department who are constantly telling me how amazing the stuff is. Of course, the problem there in a computing department is the poisoning or undermining effect that sort of came up earlier on, which is, as my colleagues are now realizing that if they do emphasize this stuff, for them, it's okay. As already existing experts, they can spend that time tweaking things, which I would argue is not even a productivity benefit. But obviously, nobody's going to learn how to code if they are using those tools in the first instance. They're not going to be in a position to be the next generation of bug fixers because they won't know what the bugs are in the first place. So again, a systemic effect in terms of coding, just as a kind of aside. I think the problem I'd have with all these technologies, and the concern I'd have, to be frank, of the kind of applications you're talking about, is they are essentially bullshit technologies, in the sense that they can only bullshit. They are probabilistic technologies. There's no relation to facticity. There's no, although we talked about guardrails before, and we can go into that, there's no real way of constraining what they do. And I mean that about deep learning as well, not just about generative AI. Generative AI is a florid example of that because we can see it. We can understand the language it's producing. But I'd say the same thing about attempts to do data analysis or predictions through something like vanilla deep learning or whatever. The problem is that these things are not trustable in a fundamental sense. So in areas that I care about, like healthcare, like welfare, like education, or any socially critical activity, there are many things that probably where bullshit is kind of the main product, and it doesn't matter what you do with AI. But in any of those kind of things that sustain society, I would say it's really not a good idea to build that in. And we will see the systemic effects. We will see over time how that unfolds in a number of damaging outcomes of the kind that we were talking about much more obviously in relation to Horizon IT scandal and the robo-debt scandal. You're building in technical debt, social debt, you're building in healthcare debt by relying on these systems. Now, I'm sure the way you're doing it is incredibly careful and doesn't fall into any of those traps.
Well, just on that point, sorry, one last point, if I could, Peter.
Yeah.
Given you've just referred to it as bullshit, which I take your point is because it is probabilistic and the like, but you can stop it being bullshit by being very careful about the exact data that you train it on, and making sure that it's very limited in what it is allowed to respond to. Like, you can actually reduce the errors to zero in our experience if you are very, very careful about the training data and the guardrails that you put up around it. So I'm not dismissing your point, by the way. I think that's probably unusual. I mean, we're in the unique scenario of having very limited use cases that we are trying and issues that we are trying to solve. And if it's a more general use case, that's obviously much harder to have limited training data, and therefore the chance of it becoming, effectively making mistakes and delivering more bullshit is higher. But it's not always the case, is my point. And I think you can leverage this technology in a way which is very, very useful and produces significant productivity gains. But you just have to be careful about how you do it.
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree. I would disagree because I don't think it's possible to reduce the errors to zero. I think that's formally provable with AI. I think what you can do is asymptotically reduce the level of detectable errors. The thing I'd be concerned about there is that you're not actually even reducing necessarily the level of errors, you're reducing their detectability. This is the weird thing about AI is that this improvability means better brands of bullshit. Now, it might be that those errors are sort of imperceptible in a particular use case and are not affecting people's material outcomes, which is great. But what I'd really like to get to is the point of the whole scenario. You mentioned it yourself. And we have the same narrative in education. We have the same narrative as in healthcare, as in everywhere else. Along comes somebody with the so-called magic technology and says, look at you poor worker in this situation. You're completely overwhelmed and you're stressed. Why is that? And why is AI being proposed as so? This is no solution to anything at all. People shouldn't be in that overwork situation at all. Resources shouldn't be directed in the way they are being directed. And AI is really just an attempt to cover that up. It's not just an opacity technology inside, it's an opacity technology outside. We should be fundamentally challenging the construction of any of these situations and saying, where is the money going right now? Because it's not going to the right place, it's not going to the place that they need it. And it certainly is flooding into AI. There are trillions being spent on AI. For what? For Sora, for transcription that you can't even trust. I mean, I don't know. I'm not trying to knock your application of it, and good for you for trying to make it work. And that's going to come across very patronising, isn't it? But sorry, we basically disagree. I don't think it's a good idea. But I think
I'm used to people disagreeing with me on this podcast, Dan, so don't worry.
Yeah, join the club.
The
And
context.
can I also say,
Yeah.
I found your analysis challenging when I saw you pushing back on Darren Asimoglu's piece in Prospect, which I've been a big fan of the idea, which I think is embodied in Dan's work as well, which is that you do get value and productivity out of the technology if you put it in the hands of the workers. But then you had a real whack at Darren for pushing small language models, and it felt a bit like mum and dad fighting, because I like both your thinking. And I'm just interested in how that's gone down, and, you know, how where you're positioning yourself, there is no real space for any of this technology to be used well.
Well, I mean, I had obviously I'm not making myself popular with that stance. He didn't actually phone me up and tell me off, so maybe it wasn't that bad. You know,
It was Prospect, yeah.
You know, yeah, I mean, he seems like a nice guy, you know. I would say he doesn't understand AI at all. It seems to me similar to another not entirely well-tempered argument I had with TUC the other day, which is the Trade Union Congress in the UK, which I'm trying to has produced a big report on AI, and a lot of it is great. You know, a lot of it I wouldn't argue with any more than I'd argue with the stuff that Dan's saying about where we're trying to get to. You know, it's about workers being valued, you know, and having a fair share of the pie, and having some control of what's going on, all that kind of stuff. But it's kind of, I guess, to me, it's missing the basic point, which is that, for example, in that case, you know, this is not an automation technology. It's not a productivity technology. It is fundamentally constructed as an anti-worker technology. So why would you want to embrace it, you know, as a worker-led organization? This stuff is toxic. What we'd understand as work, to what we'd understand as social production, as what we'd understand as something that benefits society in an environmental or social sense. So yeah, I disagree, because he's trying to do what he would understand to be the right thing within his context, which is you've got an automation technology and it's currently controlled by these oligarchic interests, then a better way to go would be this. And it does seem that the scale of the technology, you know, the hugeness of large language models is a source of their downfall. Two reasonable but not grounded assumptions. It's not an automation technology, and the only problem with AI is not scale. Scale is a massive problem with AI, and one thing that reveals its fundamental alignment with the overall growth, the infinite growth mentality of the economy as a whole. But it's not the only problem. You know, it's just simply not a functional technology. It's a computational form of conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, of course, because one of the questions I've always got is like, these productivity benefits are spruiked, but like to what end? So what, we can work more in worse jobs, doing less interesting things. It's never framed as, oh, we'll get the 4-day week, or, oh, you'll get more time to do care work, like caring for children or caring for people who are elderly in your life. Like, that is never the productivity framing for a reason, right? It's never like, oh, we're going to automate government services so it's easier for you to get access to the disability support pension. It's always, we're going to use it to identify fraud and rationalize the services offered by the state. So I do think there's this fundamental challenge in ever trying to separate the technology from the social context in which it's deployed. So even if you find these good use cases, the overwhelming context, you can read the play. I mean, this is where I think this very long post from Ed Zitron and another post from Cory Doctorow this week, reflecting on some of the reporting in the financial press about the immense pressure now on large foundational models, but particularly OpenAI as the largest, to recover the expenses that have been invested. And what is that going to look like? That's going to look like more anti-worker deployment, more engagement in military context, because that's where the money is, huge amounts of pressure to make the experience of using this technology exploitative for advertising. I mean, that's where I think it starts to look a little naive to presume that you can separate the technology from its social context, because the money will dictate how it ends up being used. I mean, is that where you end up, Professor Dan?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, it's where I started in a way.
Okay,
I think,
that's fair.
because I
Taking
don't
the
mean
long
that.
way
I mean,
round.
I'm trying to affirm what you're saying, because, why I wrote the book and my work since then has really just been trying to say this is techno-political. That actually the technology and politics have never been separate. I mean, that idea is another illusion as well. So we just need to treat it like that. We just need to start from saying this is techno-political and then talk about the relations of power that this is likely to induce or exaggerate or amplify, whatever it is. And I think that, I mean, I'd actually say the situation is slightly worse than you said, right? In the sense that, well, maybe put another way. I mean, if this is a positive, to say AI is a clarion call for questioning a lot of things. One of the things, for example, we should question is the very idea of productivity. I mean, there's a real resonance there, and that, because the idea of productivity is, of course, is itself a product, of the particular economic system that we live under. And one of the things that seems very clear, strikes me at the moment, is the relationship between productivity and the increasing marginalization of the so-called unproductive. Maybe this goes back to some of our conversations about social security and welfare as well. I mean, one thing that disturbed me when I did do that kind of lid lifting and sort of look back to where I came from is its utter entanglement with concepts of eugenics. That's really where the concept of intelligence in artificial intelligence comes from. And that's not a matter of history. That's where a lot of the thinking around Silicon Valley clearly situates itself. And if we're looking at something that's an overall dynamic that goes way beyond AI, because I think it came up a lot during COVID, it is the full return of eugenics, not that it never went away. And so I want to question when we look at productivity itself, and this is taken as another unalloyed good, as if like growth is an unalloyed good. These are the very things we should be questioning, because they're the things that led to AI in the first place, and in that horrible kind of feedback loop, the kind of things that it's going to exaggerate.
Professor, can I get you to talk in a little bit of detail about your thinking around the idea of workers' councils and people's councils to determine how AI should be rolled out in either workplaces or communities? I think it's one of the really interesting ideas that is worth spreading out a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, well, the idea of workers' council is very much, because I don't disagree with anything that you guys might say, Peter particularly, because I read your piece about it, about worker control in an economic context. I think that's a good thing. Clearly from everything I said, I would start by saying, no thanks to AI, where next? But actually, the concept of the workers and people's councils also comes out from the other effect for me of pervasive AI is a general degradation of thought process, degradation of social relations. But that's just an exaggeration of the situation we're already in. We know about neoliberalism. We know about the atomization of our sense of individuality. We know about, the consumerism that's meant to take us away from the feeling and any feelings at all, let alone feeling about what's important. I mean, these get broken through. The depth of feeling about the genocide in Palestine has broken through that sort of social numbness. But most of the time, the relations that we're brought up in, that shape us as people, that shape how we relate to each other, map very closely onto the kind of things, to me, that AI is there to perpetuate and amplify. So the Workers' Council or Workers and People's Councils, for example, because again, like technopolitics, there's no way of separating the workplace from the non-workplace, from the rest of the community, from social reproduction in particular. That's why I emphasize the feminist critiques. But in a nutshell, the idea of the Workers' Council and People's Council is as a mechanism for transforming ourselves in the process of challenging what's going on. The idea of it being a collective process is that we have to rediscover, obviously, to some extent, our sense of collective power, but just our sense of agency. I mean, it's so kind of typically ironic that one of the latest, hypes, I guess, trends in AI is this idea of agentic AI, which is a dangerous nonsense. But it's also this naming of agency. That's what we don't have and haven't had and aren't invited to have. And that's what we really need to reclaim. And to reclaim that, to some extent, we need to change ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the products are either companionship or agency. Two of the things that...
Spot on, I'd say. Spot on.
Dan?
Oh, look, I'm going to probably sound defensive, but I guess that's nothing new on this podcast, is it?
We love you.
Yeah, sometimes maybe. I'm sure. I mean, I think I agree in theory, Professor Dan, with what you're saying around the Workers' Council side of things, and I guess I can't help but reflect on how we have deployed this technology in my own organisation, right? But if you take one of the things that I touched on earlier, which is the automation of customer queries that come in via email and live chat to our team. So we've got a team of 8 customer success or customer support people, and there is more work than they can possibly get through, right? So the consequence of that is a huge amount of time is spent typically responding to, like in more than half the cases, the exact same problem over and over again that different individuals are having. And so in automating the text-based queries, what that has enabled that team to do is have more meaningful interactions with other humans, which they all like. Like this is not a matter of opinion. This is they've been involved in this process on the whole way through. And it is a productivity gain, at least as I see it. So I'm not saying that power is nothing in looking at this at a systemic level, but I just don't see why it has to be everything. Like, why can't you be critical of the fact that there's a small number of technology companies based in Silicon Valley typically that are getting disproportionate benefits and being, careless and reckless and everything else, while still celebrating the fact that this technology can make workers' lives better and can make people's jobs better. I mean, Lizzie, it might not be a 4-day week, but it's certainly more enjoyable work for these for the people that are impacted by this, at least in our
Do you give them
experience
lunch
so far.
now as well, Dan? Sorry.
Cheap shot, Peter. Cheap shot. Cheap shot.
Cheap shot.
Just disclosure, I employ people too.
Yeah. Anyway, do you give them lunch? Anyway, sorry.
Only
Professor
on
Dan,
Tuesdays.
back to you.
Well, I'm not here to. I don't know the context of your organisation or the kind of automation you're talking about, so I can't really pick up on the details, and I wouldn't want to sit here anyway and tell you that I'm not here to say to individual people you're doing the wrong thing. I'm here just to try to express a different perspective on the narrative, because I think it's really important to have a different understanding of what's going on. What I would say is that, or where we definitely agree, is that relationality and context are important. And I think these are the things that are constantly erased by AI. And that's why I have such concern around it in relation to, for example, healthcare, because my examination of what's currently happening in the UK and this massive attempt to automate healthcare, which I also am a user of, is the concerning sense that actually this technology cannot do a lot of the really, really important things in life and in healthcare, for example, which is the embodied nuance that comes from relationships between two embodied beings, basically. That when I'm with a doctor, yes, they are listening to what I'm saying, they're observing my body language, they're, maybe they have experience of me in the past, they have experience of lots of other patients as well, but that's not transmitted as an encoded set of weights in the model. That's their lived experience, and includes things like intuition and empathy and so on and so forth. And so my general concern is where that is removed. I'm not against automating the boring stuff. I do that all the time. I do think there are other ways to do that. I mean, reliably automating the boring stuff to me doesn't include large language models, for example, or deep learning. I'm not saying throw all computing in the bin. There are loads of other problems with computing. A lot of them related to the climate crisis, embodied carbon, and mineral conflict minerals. A load of other problems with computing. I'm not saying throw all computing in the bin. What I am saying is that this particular end product of late stage neoliberalism, or neoliberalism, I think we should call it, given the level of nihilism involved, is not where we need to be starting from in order to achieve any of the things that we probably agree on.
Lizzie, one last go.
Oh, well, the only kind of we talked a little bit about pattern recognition, right? And I think it's an astute observation that you could apply that to these kinds of iterations of products within a capitalist dynamic. But talking about healthcare, there is some analysis of data that I think could yield some benefit for highlighting kind of existing biases, not if done in a way that conceals them or amplifies them. But I remember I was reading a blog by Ben Schmidt ages ago when I was writing my book, and he says it's like the inversion of the Marxist quote of, philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. Maybe using computers to analyze large data sets in some of these contexts, the point is to interpret the world, not to change it, right? Because it can tell you things that you might know to be true, but it confirms it. So, he's done a whole lot of analysis of Rate My Professor, like professor blogs where students give feedback, and some of the conclusions are really exactly what you would expect. Like women giving homework is perceived as worse than men, right? So there's this huge analysis he's done based on the gender of the professor. And that's the only kind of pattern recognition that I could potentially see use for, to confirm what many people suspect to be true, but explain how this bias might arise and occur so that we can work to end it, not so that it can be built into automated systems, which is inevitably what you do if you're training on retrospective, backward-looking data. So that, I wonder what you think about that, like as a pattern recognition tool for decompartmentalizing, deconstructing existing biases. Is there utility in not necessarily large language models, but at least computerized analytics of large amounts of data?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I generally say that in itself, if you look at it in practice, is usually just a form of deferment. As you say, people already know. In fact, I'd step back and question why, and this is one of those things to do with changing our sort of overall subjectivities and perspectives. Why do we feel the need that we need this thing called data in order to confirm our experience? If I was looking back again to the workers' council related ideas, I'd say a far better approach would be workers' inquiry, which is you just simply ask people for their direct experience. I mean, one of the things I wrote in that book, and I wrote that book quite a long time ago now, so obviously there's a few other things that weren't said in there, but one of the things I did try to identify was this idea of epistemic injustice, where you allow this idea of datafication, data analysis to supersede and override people's lived experience. So I think there's far greater richness in people's lived experience and far more knowledge that people already have of the situations that they're in. And what we need are methodologies to clarify and mobilize that. And going down this road, and this would be even before, the fact that I would never trust a data analysis coming out of anything related to neural networks. So I get what you're saying. I think it's, because of the opacity of AI, we'll never be able to deal with intersectionality of actual context. But in general, I would just say, like, why do we need to datafy this stuff in the first place? We already know what's wrong, and we already know what needs to change. So let's get on with it.
Hey, finally, Professor, you proudly identify as a Luddite, as I do. The Luddites' political theory of change was to take on the technology. In terms of modern Luddism, what is the political theory of change in your mind?
I'd interpret Luddism through this idea of technopolitics, really, that there is no technology that doesn't have a politics, and that we need to think about the politics of a technology. And this is where it relates to Luddism before it's unleashed on society. I mean, it goes right back to the beginning of the conversation, really. We're talking about this idiot Altman going, "Oh, hey, here's our latest toy for you to degrade your social environment." This synthetic video generation tool. It's like, why on earth is he in that position, or any of these people in that position? Why are any technology innovations unleashed on society without the participation of the people who are going to be affected by them, are going to work in them, are going to experience their social consequences? And that's for me the message of Luddism, really, that this was an imposition of a technology rather than consideration of what that technology would do to already existing communities and to already existing lives. So my Luddism is in practice related to something that I derive from Illich now, which is the idea of convivial technology, which is that we should be in a position of examining and testing through collective processes the likely implications of any technology before we ever allow it to come into the world.
On that note, thank you so much for the time that you've given us this evening. If you're listening to this podcast and you like this discussion, we're probably we're doing a national tour, Professor. We're doing town hall meetings starting in a couple of nights' time in Adelaide and then going around the country. So we'll put links to those events in the show notes. We'd love to see you, to keep having these conversations. It's all framed up around how can democracy survive AI?
How we get democracy to survive AI.
Yeah, I did say the how. I keep remembering it. But also it is about, I love the idea of not just analyzing things, but qualitative inputs. I've been, that's what I do in my day job. So actually letting stories drive rather than bits of data, it sounds very much part of the puzzle from where I'm sitting. Anyway, on that note, we'll see you guys on the road, and thanks for being part of Burning Platforms. You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on October 6 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.